I'm Andrew Day. You are Connor Echols, and this is NonZero World, where we cover the global news, including the latest developments in U.S. foreign policy, and we interview a leading expert or activist. To gain access to full-length episodes of NonZero World and other exclusive content, listeners should go to Robert Wright's NonZero newsletter on Substack and become an NZN member today. So, Connor, today we'll be covering some of the topics that we wrote about in The Earthling, which is the weekend edition of the NonZero newsletter. And the topics we'll be talking about today are some Trump staffing updates, the situation in Syria, the political crisis in South Korea, Elon Musk's changing views on climate change, some updates on the US-China Cold War, and a possible left-right MAGA coalition. Then after this kind of rapid-fire news round, we'll have a more in-depth analytical discussion about the political crises in Romania and Georgia and how the Biden White House has responded to those crises. We're also going to have an interview with foreign policy analyst James Carden about what kind of foreign policy we can expect from a second Trump administration. After that, you and I will do a little reflection on the interview. But Connor, which news item do you want to talk about first?
Yeah, so I want to lead off this week with the situation in South Korea, which has developed a lot since President Yoon Suk Yeol attempted to impose martial law and arrest his opposition last week. So basically, the government is in a complete state of paralysis as Yoon kind of holds out and insists that he must be either impeached or not leave office. He refuses to resign. But we got some new details this week about exactly what he attempted to do, which was quite kind of lurid in some ways. He apparently had conspired with the defense minister, who has since resigned and been arrested, to either mount some sort of false flag attack using South Korean soldiers that were dressed in North Korean uniforms, or even attempts to provoke an attack from North Korea on the South in order to justify the martial law declaration. Of course, we know that neither of those things succeeded and that the legislature was quickly able to reverse this martial law declaration, but it's nonetheless thrown the country into pretty total crisis. So as I noted before, while we think about what's going to happen next, the defense minister, who actually happens to be Yoon's best friend from high school, which is just an interesting fact, resigned from his position, was arrested. Yoon remains committed to only being impeached or staying in office. And there's going to be a vote on that impeachment Saturday, tomorrow, where he's probably expected to be impeached. It's a bit tricky. The opposition party needs 8 more votes in order to get that impeachment through, and so at least 8 members of Yoon's party will have to vote to impeach their own leader. At least 7 have said that they would do so, but it remains a little unclear at this point. So that'll be razor thin. And then that sets up in the kind of near term a pretty total paralysis across the South Korean government. During this impeachment process, they will essentially not have a head of state or not a legitimate head of state for the next potentially 6 months, which will be very challenging as they seek to kind of cement ties with the incoming Trump administration. A great concern coming out of many sort of mainstream policy analysts in DC is that this will lead to the return to power of the Democratic Party in Korea, which is the opposition party. That party is very much against U.S. foreign policy in the region as it's currently constructed. They are in favor of closer engagement and potentially reconciliation from the North rather than military deterrence. And they also would seek more likely a greater economic relationship with China. So that's created a lot of fears in D.C. And there's even some kind of concerns from more hawkish parts of D.C. that this could lead, coinciding with Trump's broad desire to withdraw troops from the Korean Peninsula that we saw in his first term, that this could actually lead to the end of the U.S. presence on the peninsula. So this is a thing that we're going to probably be watching quite closely in the next few months, and that may factor into our discussion about democratic backsliding among U.S. allies later in this conversation. But for now, I'll throw it back to you, Andrew, for the next bite.
Sure. So there are some signs that the MAGA movement could become maybe is becoming a left-right coalition and scrambling American politics in the process. In The American Conservative, the libertarian commentator Jack Hunter points to some recent interactions on X in which progressives and MAGA conservatives have embraced each other or found common ground. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, published a post with this surprising first sentence: Elon Musk is right. Sanders went on in that post to criticize the Pentagon's bloated budget and the lack of congressional opposition to the military-industrial complex. And it seems to me that Sanders was trying to direct Musk's enthusiasm for budget cuts away from entitlements and toward defense spending, which Sanders says is full of waste and fraud. Musk has also said the Pentagon budget has too much waste. And Trump says that the U.S. is overcommitted abroad and should focus more on its problems at home. So you can kind of see the strategy for Sanders. Both Elon Musk and Matt Gaetz, the pro-MAGA former congressman, responded positively to Sanders' post, with Gaetz even writing, "Welcome home, Bernie." In this piece by Jack Hunter, he doesn't just look at stuff happening on Twitter, of course. Among the other things he discusses is the fact that Trump's America First precursor, Pat Buchanan, forged cross-party, cross-ideological alliances. He had helped to build a left-right coalition to oppose the Iraq War, for example. He had nice things to say about Ralph Nader, the left-wing activist. Of course, there was also some speculation back before Trump's first term that he would unite populists on both left and right against the establishment, including the foreign policy establishment. 12% of Bernie voters defected to Trump in the general election. But obviously, a left-right coalition didn't really form fully under the MAGA banner. Arguably, Trump's personality and brand were just too toxic among progressives for a left-right MAGA coalition to form. And as president, his economic policies weren't too different from a standard Republican. But Jack Hunter at least thinks that there's a good chance that this time will be different, and that the axis of ideological alignment, I guess you could say, in America, it won't be left and right. It'll be increasingly establishment versus anti-establishment. And I'll toss it back to you, Connor.
So the next thing I wanted to pick up on here is that, Trump, President-elect Trump, is continuing to fill out his foreign policy team. A new person that he appointed towards the end of last week is David Perdue, the former senator from Georgia, who Trump hopes will be his ambassador to China. Now, Perdue has a somewhat controversial background for this position. He wrote earlier this year that the United States and China are already at war, and that China is carrying out a quote-unquote new war using cyber attacks and infiltration of foreign governments and economies through Chinese companies, which he sees as essentially an extension of the Chinese government. He's also referred to Chinese leader Xi Jinping as a modern-day emperor, and said that his primary goal and China's primary goal is to become a new hegemon and, in the process, destroy capitalism and democracy. Now, this is going to create significant problems because those are obviously undiplomatic, comments from a diplomat. So we've seen some, anonymous sources in Politico this week talking about how essentially Chinese officials are going to be very reticent to even sit down with Perdue unless he's able to walk back these comments. And it's unclear if he wants to walk them back or if he actually will end up doing so. So that's something to watch. On the less hawkish side of the spectrum, Donald Trump announced this week that he will be appointing Michael Anton as the director of policy planning at the State Department. This is a less well-known position, but it's actually quite influential. It's been held by people like Jake Sullivan, former CFR, Council on Foreign Relations boss, Richard Haass, a lot of very influential people in DC policy circles. And Anton fits more neatly within probably the foreign policy restraint movement. He has been sharply critical of the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. And has even argued that the U.S. should not intervene to defend Taiwan in case of a Chinese invasion. So that's a very kind of big split, obviously, from the views of Perdue. I'm going to leave any more conversation about this to our later on conversation with James Carden, which will be very interesting. So I will leave it there for now. But in the meantime, I'll throw it back to you, Andrew, for our next news bite.
Sure. So, a Washington Post report reveals why Elon Musk, a former climate crusader, now downplays the short term risks of global warming. Musk has grown more confident that nuclear energy will help us cut greenhouse gas emissions. In recent years, he's been exposed to conservative ideas about climate change on X, his own social media site. And Musk apparently took it as a snub when the Biden White House excluded Tesla from an electric vehicle summit in 2021. The Post says that incident turned Musk against the Biden administration, and it seems implied that it turned him towards Biden's political opponents and eventually Donald Trump. The Post also highlights the influence on Musk of a network of influential conservatives who question the scientific consensus on climate change. For example, Vivek Ramaswamy, the conservative entrepreneur, has argued that predictions of climate catastrophe are greatly exaggerated. Obviously, Musk is now a major player in Trump world. He and Ramaswamy will co-head a commission on government efficiency, and people, especially environmental activists, are wondering whether Musk's evolving views will make him less likely to push back on Trump policies that would worsen the climate crisis. And indeed, the Post reports that Musk is ready to swallow the Trump proposed elimination of tax credits for electric vehicles and instead lobby for policies that would help his other businesses, notably SpaceX and its internet provider Starlink. And investors seem to think Musk will succeed in those lobbying efforts. SpaceX's valuation has jumped since the election, and Bloomberg reports that Musk's businesses overall have seen a boost since the election, owing to his ties to Donald Trump. Lastly, I just want to say that this Washington Post piece, it wasn't just like a hit job. Maybe they don't like Musk very much, or they don't trust people who downplay global warming, but there really is an interesting story worth telling here. I mean, Elon Musk used to require that figures, data from Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth documentary be included in internal presentations at Tesla. He was himself in Leonardo DiCaprio's climate documentary, in which Musk called for a popular uprising against the fossil fuel industry. But now he's trying to calm people down about climate change, kind of pushing back against the climate doom perspective, at least with respect to short-term risks. He does see it as a long-term problem. So there's a story here, and the Post piece, I thought, did a good job telling it. And I'll toss it back to you, Connor.
So our next story is going to bring us back to Syria, which had another really, truly remarkable week. On Sunday, the Assad regime fell after a little over 50 years of pretty complete and iron rule over the Syrian people. There were widespread celebrations throughout the country, and refugees came streaming back from neighboring countries like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon to differing extents, and celebrated the end of a 13-year civil war that has killed some 600,000 people during that period. Of course, amid all this celebration, there's also significant nervousness about what's going to come next. The primary rebel group involved in this march toward Damascus that toppled the government is called HTS. That's the anglicized acronym of its Arabic name, and HTS is on the U.S. list of terrorist groups. It has former associations with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and its leader has even closer relationships with those groups, but has claims to have moderated in the intervening times and seems to be quite popular within Syria now. So that creates serious challenges for the United States as it debates how to move forward. It looks as if the United States will not, at least in the next week or so, or in the very short term, remove the terrorism designation from HTS, though that could change and would be completely at the discretion of the president. Now, at the same time, America has a significant set of sanctions that they've imposed on Syria over the years. There is more momentum behind removing those sanctions in order to facilitate a Western-friendly political transition. Even some members of the Republican Party who would usually not necessarily be in favor of such a move have called for sanctions removal. So that's a story to look out for. And then it's important to note that even though the Assad regime has fallen and the civil war is effectively over, there is still fighting happening in different parts of the country. Israel has mounted a small invasion near the Golan Heights, which are Syrian territory that Israel has occupied since 1967. Israel claims that it needs a buffer zone in order to protect itself from the HTS-led transition. And the United States has backed it up in that decision, though at the same time, most international law experts have said that Israel's incursions into Syria, as well as its bombings of Syrian army positions throughout this past week, are a violation of international law. There's so much more to say about this, but not really enough time to say it here at the top in News Bites. So if you want more, I highly recommend that you check out Robert Wright, our editor-in-chief's conversation with Josh Landis from earlier this week. It's available in your podcast feed if you're listening to this there, and it's also on our YouTube channel. I highly recommend that you check that out. Josh Landis is a very leading expert on Syria who walks through many of the challenges that this transition will now face. And with that, I will send it back to you, Andrew.
Sure. So our last item in this rapid-fire news roundup is about China. Beijing recently suspended one of its top military officers. His name is Admiral Miao Hua, over corruption. And this certainly was not a one-off event. Admiral Dong Jun, China's defense minister, is also under investigation. Both of his predecessors were removed from office for corruption, and there are other high-ranking military officers currently under scrutiny. And corruption in this context often means officers taking bribes and in exchange promoting their underlings. Since taking power in 2012, Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been trying to purge corruption from the armed forces, but the fact that more than 10 years later, China is still dealing with corruption among its most senior military officers suggests that this program might not be going very well. And a new report in The Economist looks at how U.S. officials are reacting to these developments. I have a quote. The turmoil in China's high command reinforces a belief among several senior American officials that China will not be ready to invade Taiwan in this decade, as some had feared, end quote. Previously, U.S. officials had worried that in the period between 2027 and 2030, China would have this window of opportunity to invade Taiwan. Xi has ordered the military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, at least according to the CIA. And there's new American bombers and submarines that won't get to Taiwan or won't be ready for use until the 2030s. So that's why they're looking at this window. But The Economist says at least some high-ranking U.S. officials are less pessimistic now. They don't think that she's going to be able to invade Taiwan in that time, in part due to these corruption issues in China's armed forces that I mentioned, which have compromised military readiness. And in this week's issue of The Earthling, we have 4 U.S.-China Cold War updates. This was just one of them. So if listeners want to learn more about that subject, they should go to the newsletter. But now I want to turn to our more in-depth analytical discussion of what's been going on lately in Romania and Georgia and how the Biden White House has responded to these developments. First, I'll kind of lay out the facts, and then I'll toss it to you for some analysis, and then I'll have something to say, I'm sure. But last week, the top court of Romania, its constitutional court, annulled the results of the country's recent presidential election just days before a runoff. The winners of the first round were this right-wing populist, last name Georgescu, who shocked the establishment with his strong performance. He's been called a pro-Russian candidate, which is something he denies. He denies that he's pro-Russian because he wants his country to be more neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war. And his opponent in the now canceled runoff was a pro-EU liberal named Elena Lasconi. The court canceled the results of the first round on grounds that there had been Russian interference in the election, and it declassified an intelligence report which said that the pro-Georgescu campaign on TikTok was irregular and possibly inorganic. Even Lasconi, Georgescu's pro-EU opponent, said the court's decision, as she put it, crushes the very essence of democracy. Of course, she too was kind of negatively affected by the court's decision because she was going to be in the second round election. But it's still notable that she said that. And yet, the U.S. State Department supported the court's decision. It said Romanians deserve to have confidence that their elections are free of foreign influence. And we'll talk about why the White House might have reacted that way. But in Georgia, which is currently being rocked by massive protests in anticipation of its presidential election this weekend, the current president has said she'll stay in office after her term expires, and she's cast as illegitimate the nation's parliamentary elections that took place in October. The Georgian Dream Party, which is the governing party in parliament, it did well in those elections. Georgian Dream is skeptical of the EU. It wants to maintain a certain distance from the EU. It has resisted Western pressure to aid Ukraine's war effort against Russia. It's passed controversial measures requiring foreign-backed NGOs to register as foreign agents. And it's used its majority in parliament to enact some kind of significant changes. For example, the next president won't be elected directly by the people. The next president will be elected by the parliament. So that's one of the things that the opposition is objecting to. The European Union is calling for a rerun of the election, citing alleged voting irregularities. The Biden administration has said the parliamentary elections were plagued by voter intimidation, coercion, and misuse of government resources. But the OSCE, this regional organization in Europe, it had dispatched election monitors to observe the October elections. And if you read that report, which they produced, you'll notice they do have some criticisms of how tense and polarized Georgia is. They do point to some alleged instances of intimidation, but the report basically says the election was free and fair. You know, the voters were given an actual meaningful choice. The candidates were able to campaign freely. The process was transparent and reasonably well organized. So that's the state of play in Georgia and Romania. So Connor, what are you thinking about these developments?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about all this, but maybe I'll jump off of your last point there and then talk a little bit about sort of the hypocrisy angle with all of this, which I think will be an important one. But the election monitoring aspect I found really interesting. I also went and out of curiosity read some other reports that the OSCE has put out. From monitoring elections in Poland and Albania and Turkey and different countries. And one thing that you see pretty consistently is that, there's this wide range of things that one could call democracy, right? There's this kind of difficult decision to be made about when you see an election as legitimate or illegitimate, this like massive gray area. And, if you read the report about the Turkish elections, it's very, very similar to the report about the Georgian ones. But we did respect the results of the Turkish elections and we did acknowledge them. And there were members of opposition parties that did succeed in those. Similar things can be said about the situation in Poland. And those are, of course, two of America's NATO allies. And, Poland is at least a member of the, European Union. So there's kind of a challenging question here of, to what extent should foreign states be dictating a local country's democracy, be dictating what it means for them to, justifiably elect their own representation and for that to genuinely represent them. Because there's clearly intense polarization inside Georgia. But at the same time, it seems that there's a significant amount of popularity for this Georgian Dream Party as well. So, the U.S. stepping in and kind of putting our finger on the scale is seemingly, not particularly democratic in this situation. I think it's much more clear cut in Romania, where, the fact that both candidates that were going to be part of this election rejected this judge's decision as illegitimate, and then the U.S. said it was legitimate. I mean, that is kind of an open and shut case of the U.S. making decisions based on its geostrategic objectives and its geopolitical goals rather than this kind of stated commitment to democracy. So I don't know. Do you have anything on that before we go to the hypocrisy angle, or maybe that kind of leads us into the hypocrisy angle?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point about there's kind of a variety of democracies and different criticisms you can make of different democracies. And I think hopefully this isn't too like theoretical, but what I was thinking of when you were talking is, when the Biden administration says it wants to defend democracy globally, what they mean is liberal democracy, right? And there's a tension in the concept of liberal democracy because liberalism and democracy are different things. Democracy in the modern world, at least, is about kind of elections and majority rule. Liberalism is about restraining the government, putting up a kind of protective barrier between the government and the individual or minority groups or civil society at large. And so there's a tension there. A pure democracy can be a liberal elite can be anti-democratic, right? And I think that the Biden administration, maybe unconsciously, has kind of exploited this tension and ambiguity. So, for example, if you compare the cases of India and Hungary, when it comes to India, the Biden administration highlights that it's the biggest democracy in the world, because they want India to be a kind of counterweight to China. Like geopolitical considerations are definitely at play. They want to keep India on side. So India, maybe Biden has criticized India to some extent, I don't know. But for the most part, India is kind of welcome into the democracy club, even though when you look at when you kind of judge India by the standards of liberalism, there's a lot of failures. Like this Modi government is pretty ethno-nationalist,
Yeah.
Conversely, if you look at Hungary, Hungary has not been invited into the democracy club. The Biden administration, liberals in general in America and across the West are very critical of Orban's government. And they don't focus on the fact that Orban's government has won elections and is actually pretty popular. They focus on how it's kind of illiberal actions that Orban has taken to kind of consolidate power for his party at the expense of like the judiciary, for example. And Orban himself has called Hungary's ideology or his party's ideology illiberal democracy. So like he gets the distinction. And one thing that I think makes this even more complicated is that just getting close to Russia is now perceived as illiberal and undemocratic, right? So if Romanians vote for the guy who wants to not get closer to Russia, be less hostile to Russia, not allow NATO to use Romania to like deliver weapons or whatever to Ukraine, that's perceived as in and of itself a step towards illiberalism and anti-democracy. Similarly, in Georgia, the concerns clearly are geopolitical, that this Georgian Dream Party is kind of skeptical of the EU. It doesn't want to sanction Russia because it's like a small economy and it's worried about how those sanctions will affect its economy. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this kind of how there are this point you made that there are varieties of democracy and different kind of criticisms that you could level against them. Maybe the last point that I'll make that really makes this whole democracy versus autocracy framing it seem especially kind of invalid is, I mean, the Biden administration is trying to get a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. I mean, how many countries are less liberal and less democratic than Saudi Arabia? Maybe there's some, but there's not many, right?
Definitely not. It's that. Well, that gets to the hypocrisy angle here, right? And what's interesting, people will say that, I don't know. There's so much wrapped in this issue too, because this Romanian court made the decision to overturn this on the grounds that it kind of bore the hallmarks of a Russian influence operation, which I think is sort of a distant cousin of, or maybe a close cousin of this talking point that we hear a lot in the U.S. and in Europe, that you're repeating Russian talking points or you're repeating Iranian talking points or whatever. As a way of discrediting an argument made by someone who has a different analysis, essentially, of their own country's national interests. So it kind of pulls that all together. But I would also add that on the hypocrisy angle, like this is it's not just that hypocrisy is a challenge because people find that morally gross or whatever when the U.S. says one thing and does another. It's that it actually does change public opinion, from like polling done around this question of, quote unquote, whataboutism, this idea that you say, oh, well, why are you mad at Russia? What about what the United States did in Romania, right? Or what about, this or that? polling has found that is really effective, that messaging is really effective at undermining the United States in the eyes of citizens of other countries. And that is not a good position for American policy to be in, where they're perceived as being hypocritical and saying one thing and doing another. So it has the potential to damage U.S. relations with foreign countries, and especially at a moment where this is not a world that is quite like the first Cold War, right? To the extent that there is a Cold War now, I think that we've seen clear evidence that most of the sort of middle states, right, your Saudi Arabia, India, Hungary to a lesser extent, but these kind of mid-sized states don't really want to pick a side, right? They want to have an independent foreign policy that they can guide themselves. So kind of putting a Cold War framework on all of this will be a bad fit, or would seem to be.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I guess there's a question here of how cynical exactly Biden and other politicians are being, and using this language of liberal democracy while pursuing their geopolitical aims. I don't know if it's completely cynical, like they're just lying about liking liberal democracy. But maybe we don't have quite time to get into that. I think we should probably transition to our interview with James Carden. Do you want to say a little bit about his background?
Yeah, so we're very excited to talk to James today. He is a contributing editor at the American Conservative. He's written very widely on foreign policy, with a particular focus on U.S.-Russia affairs and that relationship. He has been really closely watching, as a foreign policy columnist, the Trump transition, kind of keeping track of all of the different names you're seeing that you might not recognize, or whose, I guess, affiliations politically you might not be familiar with. So we're going to really dig into that and try to get a sense of what Trump's advisors will mean for his foreign policy. And I think James is going to give a lot of great stuff on that. That's going to help hopefully orient you towards this incoming Trump presidency.
Cool. All right, let's do it. So, James, I wanted to start by getting your general take on the foreign policy team that Trump has assembled so far to serve in his second administration. And if you could name particular appointees and give us a sense of their foreign policy views, that'd be great. And I'd also be interested to hear you talk a bit more about this article you recently wrote in the American Conservative entitled "How the Neocons Won the Transition," where you get into at least one of the reasons that Trump's appointees have been largely hawkish. So, James, what is your assessment of Trump's foreign policy team so far?
Well, it's a really mixed bag. Like anything, there are pros and cons. I mean, some of them are frankly alarming, and we've heard a lot about them already. I'm, of course, referring to Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense. I think that, the appointment of someone like Sebastian Gorka is entirely, for many reasons, inappropriate and a bad idea. I don't love Rubio's foreign policy track record, but he is somewhat, at least in the mainstream of Republican foreign policy thinking, for whatever that counts for. And then, there have been some positive appointments, right? I largely agree with Tulsi Gabbard on a wide range of issues, with the notable exception of, I think, her misguided views on Israel-Palestine. I think that, from what I've heard anyway, the man who has just been nominated to serve as the number 2 at the State Department, Christopher Landau, is a reasonable and responsible appointee who is open to a lot of the ideas that people like us care about, ideas centered around a kind of restrained, sane, dare I even say, moral U.S. foreign policy. So it's been a mixed bag. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are not so terrible. Ultimately, Trump is, to use the George W. Bush expression, he's the decider. And I guess we're going to have to see, how that goes. I think that probably, if history is any guide, the most influential person on the national security team is going to be the person who is in proximity to the president all the time. And that is, of course, Congressman Michael Waltz, who will be national security advisor. Waltz is basically, again, a typical Republican hawk. And his newly named deputy, Alex Wong, was a staffer for Rubio and Tom Cotton. So, again, not the best news for those of us in the realist and restraint world.
Yeah, I'm curious why you think, because there was a lot of, I think, enthusiasm within the foreign policy restraint movement, especially on the conservative side, about the pick for like J.D. Vance as vice president, for example, or just this idea that this might be a big moment for restraint kind of becoming more institutionalized and more engaged in government. What do you think led Trump to make these sort of unusual picks for these positions, or these sort of mainstream picks in some cases, kind of a hodgepodge all around? Like, what do you think the logic is behind all of this?
I don't think that Trump is on good terms with logic. And so trying to parse out the Trump decision-making process is a fool's errand, which I'm not going to venture into, but you're exactly right. In the hours after the election, it did seem that perhaps realists and restrainers might actually get a shot. There was a lot of hope that J.D. Vance and his relationship with Donald Trump Jr., combined with the announcements that RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard were going to be part of the transition, led some of us wrongly to assume that would mean that Trump would be staffing up people who are, like-minded on foreign policy. But that hasn't turned out to be the case. And I wrote, I think it was last week or the week before, in the American Conservative, that one of the principal reasons why that hasn't been the case is that the co-chairman of the Trump transition, a New York bond trader, not previously too well known outside of New York, by the name of Howard Lutnick, is basically in charge of the defense and foreign policy portfolios. And so Lutnick is basically, if he has any sort of foreign policy philosophy at all, it tracks very closely with that of the neoconservatives. And, Israel looms very large in Lutnick's view of the world. And of course, a couple of days ago, it was revealed that there's a man by the name of, I believe it's Peter Morocco, who apparently was on Capitol Hill during J6 and had a bunch of political appointments during the first Trump term. And apparently he's also involved with the vetting process for foreign policy appointments. So it does seem to me, through my conversations with people who have a pretty good window on what's going on down there in Florida, that Lutnick is kind of in charge of these portfolios that are important to people like us, and not so much Don Jr. or J.D. Vance, unfortunately.
Interesting. So you've mentioned Tulsi Gabbard a couple of times, and in your piece on how the neocons won the transition, you referred to her as the honorable exception to Trump's hawkish appointments. Obviously, she's been among Trump's most controversial appointments, at least in the media and foreign policy establishment. So can you say a bit about how the establishment talks about Gabbard, and then give your own sense of her competence and character?
Sure. Well, they talk about her. When they talk about her, it sounds like they are channeling the ghost of Joe McCarthy. Some of the, criticism of Gabbard coming from people like Elizabeth Warren and Debbie Wasserman Schultz is right out of that early 1950s playbook where, Tulsi Gabbard is somehow a puppet of the Kremlin and all that stuff. I think the day has thankfully past where that stuff is getting a lot of traction. I think it's certainly worn itself out after Russiagate. But some people, old habits die hard, and they can't help but speak like they're Rachel Maddow. Gabbard, I think it's the wrong job. I'm happy that she's in the mix. I'm happy that she will hopefully have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. I don't think that it makes any sense for her to become DNI.
Director of National Intelligence. Mm-hmm.
Right. She doesn't have that background. That's true. She does have a military background. She did serve in Congress. She's very well versed on foreign policy issues. I don't agree with all of her positions. Certainly not her seeming support anyway, for the Israeli rampage that's been happening over the past year. However, she would have made a much stronger national security advisor. For instance, she's a very public-facing person. She's extremely skilled at the art of public communication. You don't see really people who are the DNI on Meet the Press that often, right? How many times have we seen Avril Haines out in public? Not that often. So I think it's a missed opportunity for the Trump administration to kind of, hide her away in McLean or Tyson's Corner, or wherever the place is. So, I think it's a good thing that she's there. I'm not sure it's the right position. That's basically my bottom line.
Yeah, I'm curious. So yeah, we're talking about obviously Tulsi Gabbard here. Are there other picks that you feel good about essentially in this transition? Are there some that one that comes to mind maybe would be like Michael Anton over at State. He's got some more kind of restraint bona fides. I'm just curious to get your picture of the full landscape of appointments.
Yeah. So with your mention of Anton, you're about 3/4 of the way through the entire list, right? So we have Gabbard, we have Anton. Anton's appointment is a good one. Again, policy planning. Would we have rather had seen him at the White House? Yes. It's good that he's there. I've heard very good things about the incoming number 2 at State, Christopher Landau. Landau served as Trump's ambassador to Mexico during the first term. He's a very respected lawyer. He's one of these kind of, it seems to me, just looking at his bio, one of these kind of throwback appointments. Like he went to Groton, he went to Harvard, he went to Harvard Law, he clerked for 2 Supreme Court justices. It's kind of like a throwback to the old foreign policy establishment during the era of the wise men. Well, we don't have too many wise men these days, right? So I think that his appointment is potentially a very positive one, given the fact that I kind of expect Rubio to not be the strongest secretary. I think that Trump will pretty much be able to kick him around, and of course, he, being young, probably has ambitions beyond even Secretary of State down the line. So Anton good, Gabbard good, Landau potentially very good.
What about what do you think about Keith Kellogg? He's been appointed to be the special envoy for Russia, Ukraine. I think I remember reading something you wrote that was kind of critical of him, but he co-authored this report on how to wind down the Russia-Ukraine war, in which he proposed doing things like some sanctions relief for Russia. He's been a Russia hawk in the past, but it seems to me he's kind of toned down his Russia hawkism. What do you think about Kellogg?
Well, I hope that what I wrote was not somewhat critical. I hope it was entirely critical. I think that he belongs in the Fox News sort of category. People who I've spoken to who have served for many decades in the military, I would say don't have a ton of respect for General Kellogg's intellect. Obviously, his political instincts are very good. Otherwise, he wouldn't be in the position that he's in. I do not believe in the temporary about face that he's said to have had. on Russia, Ukraine. I think he's basically a hawk. I thought a lot of what he and his co-author, Fred Fleets, who was John Bolton's chief of staff when Bolton was the national security advisor back during Trump 1, they wrote a report that was pretty bad for the America First Policy Institute, kind of outlining their ideas to end the war. To me, basically, it would not surprise me, and I've written this, that Trump is not going to de-escalate. I have a sinking feeling that Trump and advisors like Kellogg are going to advise him to escalate in order to ultimately de-escalate and try to bring Russia to the negotiating table. I've previously said that I have a kind of, it's a 1968 sort of feeling. You had Nixon on the campaign trail in 1968 telling everyone he could on and off the record that he had a plan to, end the war. And of course, he didn't. He escalated and expanded the war into Cambodia, as we all know. So I think that that's probably the tack that they're going to take at first. I don't think it's going to be met with much success. I think the other thing that we have to really worry about now, given the events of the past week, is whether or not we are going to be involved in 6 to 18 months' time in a war on Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of curious to get more of your take on what all of this means. There's this enthusiasm that's sort of dipped down among especially conservative members of the restraint movement. Since Trump has made more of these appointments, seemingly leaning towards, like you said, their potential, confrontations in many different theaters. What does this mean for the sort of broader restraint movement? Is this a sign that it's not as developed as some people had hoped, not as influential as some people had hoped? I'm curious to get your take.
I've been thinking about the state of the kind of broader restraint movement a lot over the past couple months, occasioned by some personal, experience and interactions with it, with kind of the powers that be. I've come to the conclusion that there's kind of a fundamental, maybe structural weakness, and it has to do with the streams of funding. So on the one hand, and I don't know who funds you guys, so I'm not going to name names or whatever. I don't get anyone in trouble. But on the right, you have sort of, the funding stream that comes from doctrinaire libertarians, and they make up a lot of the space. And they have the Koch brothers have a cutout that funds a number of, think tanks that we're all familiar with on the one side. And then on the other side, there is some sympathy for realist and restraint ideas on the left, but not as much as there used to be. And I think largely thanks to Trump. And Trump, unfortunately, tarred a lot of these ideas through his association with them. So there, it just seems to me that a movement that seems wholly reliant on Koch on the one hand and Soros on the other isn't necessarily that stable. And then, of course, it excludes people who kind of have, heterodox or, ecumenical politics, right? So if you're not on board with one or the other program, it's tough sledding. So that's sort of my broad and kind of worried view of the realist and restraint movement in Washington. I think that, again, as I said earlier, hopes were high for, the first maybe 24 to 48 hours after Trump won. I mean, obviously, and, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't, follow the Democrats as closely anymore, but it seems to me that there was absolutely no chance that anyone that we think is any good was going to get anywhere under a Harris Wallace administration. So, but again, the hopes that Trump was going to kind of be a realist champion don't seem to be panning out. Bottom line, I'm not terribly optimistic. I'm glad that, these organizations exist. I'm glad that podcasts like yours exist. I'm glad that the American Conservative exists. But, you kind of worry, at what point is there going to be a breakthrough? Is it going to take, as some people have suggested, another Iraq, another terrible disaster, for people to wake up and finally start supporting these ideas? So probably too long of an answer.
Well, do you have ideas on what the restraint community could do, other than waiting for a disaster to unfold? What the restraint community could do to start translating their ideas and arguments into actual policy more effectively? This was a free preview of NonZero World. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive content, become an NCN member at nonzero.substack.com.